A brief history of the tank. World War I, this is what won the war. Post-war, it was specific to the trenches and will not be important again. World War II, the tank was blitzkrieg and blitzkrieg is best. Yom Kippur War, anti-tank missiles have made the tank obsolete. Gulf War, the tank is unstoppable. Ukraine last March, M-law makes the tank obsolete. Ukraine this March, we need more tanks.
A couple of months ago, a journalist claimed the United States was sending tanks to Ukraine because there are photos of mechanized 155mm artillery pieces being loaded onto trains. This led to the internet being abuzz with "what is a tank" memes. It's actually not a bad starting point for understanding tanks at an operational level, because at that level, we really look at tanks and other armored vehicles as a package of capabilities, strengths, and weaknesses. Fairly easy to understand that strengths and weaknesses of tanks have evolved over time. But so have the capabilities, and by that I mean the missions or roles the tank is capable of performing or optimized for performing. Let's go back to the Napoleonic era to understand what I mean. Light cavalry had fast horses, didn't have armor, typically had light equipment, and they usually carried a rather light sword. Their jobs included reconnaissance, flank guards, rear area security, convoy protection, and other various forms of patrolling. Dragoons were essentially mobile infantry. They carried the same type of arms as contemporary infantry, but they used horses for greater mobility. They wouldn't fight from horseback. They would move on horseback to a new location, leave maybe 1 in 5 men to hold the reins of all the horses, run up into a firing position, engage the enemy, run back down to the horses and locate somewhere else. Now you'll note that neither light cavalry or dragoons are well suited to attacking the front line of the enemy. If you want to break the front line of an enemy infantry formation during the Napoleonic Wars, you had two options. One was to engage them with an infantry advance, and the other was to use heavy cavalry. Now, if the infantry or the heavy cavalry are advancing towards an enemy infantry formation, they would rely heavily on fire support from what was called field artillery. Now, field artillery was a light gun that could be quickly limbered up and moved within a couple of 100 meters, usually 200 to 400 meters at most, from the enemy front line. It would then fire into the infantry formation in order to put holes in the front line. This is distinct from the siege artillery that was mostly stationary during the battle and engaged at ranges closer to 400 meters to 2 kilometers. Heavy cavalry wore armor. They typically had heavy swords for hacking. They often had lances and pistols. Their horses also were trained to charge straight at masses to a certain extent, and so their job would be to actually gallop straight into an infantry formation. However, in order to accomplish this successfully, there typically needed to be a number of holes in the front line that would be created by the field artillery. By the beginning of World War I, all of these forms of cavalry still existed. However, the light cavalry, reconnaissance, trolling, and security roles were starting to be taken over by armored cars. The most famous of these was a Rolls-Royce Silver Ghost. During World War II, a couple of things changed. First of all, light cavalry conducting reconnaissance and patrolling duties disappeared. The armored car continued with increased capabilities, but fulfilled the same role. However, there were a large number of light tanks, which had been the primary form of tank at the beginning of the war, but were found to not be capable of their original mission set. That is, they were too lightly armed or armored to face the main enemy line to conduct the infantry support or breakthrough role. Some examples include the Stuart light tank and the BT-7. It was found they were quite effective at the reconnaissance roles, being somewhat slower and more cumbersome than armored cars, but also more survivable. That by the end of World War II, most reconnaissance units had a mixture of armored cars and light tanks. By the 1960s, the light tank was essentially dead as a concept. What replaced them was armored reconnaissance vehicles. The modern armored reconnaissance vehicle has armor that can defeat rifle and machine gun fire, has quite excellent mobility, might be on tracks or might be on wheels, and has a main gun that's optimized for engaging other armored reconnaissance vehicles and infantry fighting vehicles. They conduct all of the missions of Napoleonic light cavalry, reconnaissance, screening, flank guard, rear area security, convoy protection. However, they have limited to no anti-tank capability and are very poor at engaging with enemy defensive positions. The Dragoon was the mobile infantry of the Napoleonic era. At the beginning of World War I, the British Army had trained all of its cavalry to be dragoons. That is, they were equipped with the same equipment as the infantry, and trained in infantry tasks to approximately the same standard. By the end of World War I, virtually all cavalry fought as dragoons, largely because that's the only role for them left that wasn't suicidal. At the beginning of World War II, there was an identified need for infantry that could advance with tanks in order to provide infantry support prior to the advancing infantry units catching up. Initially, this was truck-mounted. However, it was quickly identified that tanks needed infantry that were as mobile and survivable as they were. By the end of World War II, most mechanized infantry operated out of half-tracks. Near the end of World War II, the Canadian Army improvised what was known as a kangaroo. Take a somewhat obsolete tank, remove the turret, and you now have an infantry carrier vehicle with heavier armor, tracks that allowed it to be as mobile as a tank, and usually just a machine gun for self-defense. This evolved into the early Cold War armored personnel carrier. The best known example of this would be the M113. However, in the mid-Cold War, the Soviet Union developed a new type of vehicle that was essentially an armored personnel carrier that had a turret with enough firepower to provide the infantry support functions that in the Napoleonic era had been conducted by the field artillery. This new type of vehicle was called the infantry fighting vehicle. Under the old system with armored personnel carriers, the APC would transport the infantry under relatively good protection to the assembly area. The infantry would then dismount from the armored personnel carrier, move into the assault position, and conduct the assault through the enemy position. For this to be successful, the dismounted infantry needed another form of armored vehicle, typically tanks, to provide a fire base so that the enemy heads would be kept down. The infantry fighting vehicle was also able to carry infantry to the assembly area and have them dismount to the assault position in relative safety. However, the now empty infantry fighting vehicle was able to provide the fire base, thereby freeing up whichever vehicles would have been required for infantry support under the old system. Current examples of infantry fighting vehicles include the Bradley and the BMP-2. At the beginning of World War I, field artillery first attempted to fight in the Napoleonic fashion. That is, light guns, such as those at about 75 millimeters, would be brought up to the front line with the infantry in order to engage the enemy over open sights. Heavy or siege artillery was still used in the indirect role. However, rifles had become accurate and long-range enough that field artillery could be easily shot at by enemy infantry. This led to horrifying losses, and the field artillery, that is the guns of about 75 millimeters, being moved further to the rear and only engaging in an indirect role. By the middle of World War I, this role was replaced by the first generation of tanks. If you take two field guns, give them tracks so they can move across the broken terrain of no man's land, and then enclose the crew in an armored box, you have a British Mark V tank. At the beginning of World War II, most countries had light tanks, also known as cavalry tanks, which were intended for breakthrough operations, exploitation deep into the enemy's rear, and as the main way of engaging enemy tanks. As mentioned earlier, these quickly became tied to the reconnaissance and patrolling role, due to them being too lightly armed and too lightly armored. The second type of tank at the beginning of World War II was either called the medium tank or the infantry support tank. These didn't have to be as fast as the light tanks, but they had heavier armor and a gun that fired at a lower velocity, that is, was not as good at penetrating armor, but was larger and therefore could carry a fairly large explosive charge. During World War II, medium tanks traded their low-velocity, high-caliber guns for high-velocity, high-caliber guns. For instance, the Panzer IV started World War II with a short-barreled 75mm gun that had a muzzle velocity of about 1,200 feet per second. It ended World War II with a long-barreled 75mm gun that had a muzzle velocity of about 2,500 feet per second. Medium tanks were still quite good at supporting the infantry. However, there were two problems. First of all, the higher velocity guns were usually not as good for supporting infantry, and second, they were quite expensive. To rectify this, they developed something called assault guns. In a lot of ways, an assault gun is more similar to both the field artillery and the World War I tank. You take a low-velocity artillery cannon and put it on tracks. Unlike a medium tank, it does not have a turret. The gun fires forward with it only being able to move a couple of degrees to the left or to the right in what's known as a casemate. This makes the assault gun lighter and cheaper, which means you can produce more of them, and you can put very strong frontal armor on it to make it very well protected. Now, it was this assault gun concept that was merged with the armored personnel carrier to create the infantry fighting vehicle. The assault gun and the infantry fighting vehicle look very different. However, they have the same capabilities when it comes to infantry fire support. As evidence of this type of thinking within the military, when the US Army adopted the Stryker system for its medium infantry brigades, that is, infantry that still used armored personnel carriers rather than infantry fighting vehicles, they lacked a system with a good capability for infantry fire support. Their solution was to mount a somewhat obsolete tank cannon, the British 105mm, onto a Stryker armored vehicle as the mobile gun system. But what most people don't realize is that the mobile gun system was designated as an assault gun. Throughout the Cold War, medium tanks continued to be better and better at the anti-tank and breakthrough roles, and consequently losing some effectiveness at the infantry fire support role. Once infantry fighting vehicles were in service, the medium tank was able to be redesigned to optimize the breakthrough and anti-tank roles. It still maintained the ability to conduct infantry fire support, but it's no longer its optimal use. This new medium tank optimized towards breakthrough and anti-tank roles is referred to as the main battle tank. Going back to the heavy cavalry of the Napoleonic era, this is also a role that was taken over by the early tank. The first generation of World War I tanks were optimized towards punching a hole through the enemy trench line. So much so that one of the main things that they did was in fact to clear barbed wire obstacles by driving through them. At the beginning of World War II, the breakthrough role was allocated largely to medium tanks. They would punch a hole through the enemy front lines that the light tanks would then go through in order to exploit in depth. However, medium tanks often didn't have the thickness of armor to conduct an assault on heavily prepared defensive positions, and so the heavy tank was developed. This was a tank that had a lot of firepower and protection, but moved quite slowly. They would be used in heavy concentration in the first stages of an offensive, and then medium tanks could take over the role of exploitation in depth. Examples of the heavy tank during World War II include the Tiger and the IS-2. During the Cold War, there was continued development of heavy tanks up until about the 1960s. These Cold War tanks tended to have a much heavier gun than the medium tank, and they lost some of their extra armor due to new anti-tank weapons, making it difficult to actually defeat an incoming attack. The heavier guns, however, did make them incredibly good anti-tank weapons. Examples of Cold War heavy tanks include the British Conqueror and the later IS series of Soviet tanks. Modern MBTs have the firepower of these early Cold War heavy tanks. In some cases, like the Conqueror, literally a later development of the same 120mm gun. Main battle tanks retain the assault and penetration role, and don't underestimate how literally and Wallace and Gromit-like I mean that. I'll discuss this in more depth in a future episode, but up to half the tanks in an armored company have plows or mine rollers, and there's also specialist engineering variants. This brings us to the last category, which is anti-tank armored vehicles. The idea behind the World War II tank destroyer was to sacrifice all the aspects of medium and light tanks that made them good at other roles such as patrolling, infantry fire support, assault, or breakthrough, and design the armored vehicle purely around killing tanks. There were two philosophies behind tank destroyers in World War II. The Americans, with the M10, made something that looked like a tank externally. That is, it had tracks and a turret, but they lightened the armor considerably. This saving in weight from the armor allowed them to mount a somewhat better gun for anti-tank work than the standard Sherman tank, and to give it a much higher cross-country speed, that is, increase its mobility. Early German tank destroyers had this same philosophy. However, midway through the war, they switched over to tank destroyers that emphasized firepower and protection while sacrificing mobility. To do this, they tended to take an assault gun and to swap out a high-velocity gun that was optimized for anti-tank work. This is how you can get the Stug, or Sturmgeschütz, literally assault gun 4, and the Panzerjäger, that is tank hunter 4. One of them has a low velocity gun for infantry support and is operated by the artillery. The other one has a high velocity gun for anti-tank work and it's operated by the Panzer arm. In the Cold War, the tank destroyer split in two once again. The German heavy tank destroyer concept really merged with heavy tanks. The early Cold War heavy tanks like the Conqueror had a larger, more powerful gun than medium tanks of their era. However, it was mounted in a turret rather than a casemate. The American light model of tank destroyer took either a light tank and then later armored reconnaissance vehicles and initially mounted a new form of anti-tank gun called the recoilless rifle. Later this was replaced by anti-tank guided missiles. Within NATO countries, this type of system tends to be called TUA, or tow under armor, because of the ubiquitousness of the TOW missile system. For this form of anti-tank asset, you take an armored personnel carrier, or an infantry fighting vehicle, and put a turret on the top with several anti-tank guided missile launching tubes. You then replace the area that had held the section or squad of infantry with additional reloads of anti-tank guided missiles. Many infantry fighting vehicles also include anti-tank guided missiles. For instance, both the BMP-2 and the Bradley carry a few. However, the modern TUA, or anti-tank missile-based tank destroyer, will typically have a turret that contains superior optics, multiple tubes for anti-tank missiles, a system for reloading quicker, and 5 to 10 times as many missiles. So going back to our initial diagram, we can see that the various types of armored vehicles and the roles they fulfill have evolved over time. On the current battlefield, you have armored reconnaissance vehicles that carry out the recce and patrolling functions of Napoleonic-era light cavalry. The dragoons, or mounted infantry, now use either armored personnel carriers or infantry fighting vehicles, the difference being that the infantry fighting vehicle also contains the fire support to infantry that used to be provided by the field artillery in the Napoleonic era. Infantry fire support can also come from main battle tanks. Main battle tanks, however, are more optimized towards either the breakthrough role of heavy cavalry or the destruction of enemy tanks, though there's also the light anti-tank weapon asset of armored vehicles mounting anti-tank guided missiles. The modern collection of vehicles is also all multi-role, with them optimized towards certain missions, but able to carry out several. To begin with, we have the armored reconnaissance vehicle. It is, of course, optimized towards reconnaissance. It does have a mobile infantry element, with most modern armored recce vehicles including a few dismounted infantry. It also has the ability to provide some infantry fire support, and, depending on the nation, has some anti-tank capability as well. However, it is totally unsuited towards the assault role. It does not have the armor or the firepower to mount a direct attack on an enemy defensive position. The infantry fighting vehicle is capable of doing reconnaissance. In fact, you often find it's the same platform used for armored reconnaissance and infantry fighting vehicles, the difference being that the armored reconnaissance vehicle has things like larger fuel tanks for more range, a better optics package, and better radios. What the infantry fighting vehicle is really optimized towards, though, is providing mobile infantry and infantry fire support. It has the firepower to conduct an assault, but its armor really is only for deflecting rifle and machine gun rounds, so it's not well suited to this. And some infantry fighting vehicles, including almost all of those used in Ukraine, have a limited anti-tank missile capability. The main battle tank isn't really suited to recce and can't carry infantry. It can conduct infantry fire support. However, the limited number of rounds carried for its enormous main gun, which is optimized for anti-tank duties, means it's not as effective as something like an infantry fighting vehicle. Its forte is really the assault and anti-tank duties. Finally, you have the armored vehicle-mounted anti-tank guided missile system. These are surprisingly good at reconnaissance due to their having good mobility and a good optics package. However, they lack the dismounts of most armored recce vehicles and are usually a fair bit taller than armored recce vehicles, making them less effective. They almost never carry infantry, and if you can find an infanteer who's willing to ride into battle sitting behind a stack of anti-tank guided missiles, well, you found someone who's very brave or very stupid. And for a similar reason, they're not suited to the assault. They are also surprisingly effective at infantry fire support, as the same anti-tank rounds are quite good at taking out fortifications and bunkers. They also carry grape shot or fragmentation rounds, which can be programmed to fly over top of enemy trenches and then detonate a warhead that includes several pounds of buckshot. However, their truly optimized role is as tank destroyers. To To bring this back to the Ukraine conflict, regardless of technology in terms of the defensive systems for tanks or anti-tank weapons, there will always be a need for something like a tank because of the role that they fulfill. And even if tanks ever disappear, it will be because they are replaced by a different weapon system that can fulfill that same role. Currently, tanks have been supplanted in the infantry support and reconnaissance roles, but these are by vehicles that are even more vulnerable to anti-tank weapons like the Javelin and the MLAW. Currently, there's no other vehicle that's as effective in the assault role or able to provide infantry fire support even when the enemy is able to return significant fire from anti-tank weapons. So if you were to abandon tanks, you immediately would need to design something to fulfill the assault, penetration, and infantry fire support roles. And due to how the engineering design process works, the vehicle you'd get at the end of that process would inevitably end up looking quite a lot like a tank. For fire support, it would need a large gun, but because it also needs to be an anti-tank asset, it needs to be a high-velocity gun. Given the non-contiguous nature of modern warfare, the gun needs to be in a turret for quick 360-degree traverse. For the penetration role, it needs tracks for mobility, and for the assault role, it needs thick armor for protection. So if you try to redesign a tank successor from the ground up, you end up with a tracked and heavily armored vehicle with a high-velocity gun in a turret. In other words, a tank. So instead what you have is an advance in anti-tank weapons capability that requires a response from tank design and from tactics. In the next episode, we'll look into that in greater depth when we examine anti-tank weapons and the system of anti-tank defense. Until then, I'll see you on the next episode.